Welcome to the 20th Annual NISTS Conference. We are thrilled that you have chosen to join us for the virtual version of NISTS 2022. We are joining you today from the Dahlonega campus of the University of North Georgia, our home institution. And we gather today on the ancestral lands of many Native peoples who were removed unjustly. And we acknowledge that we in this community are beneficiaries of that removal. We honor these ancestors as we come together to learn today, tomorrow, and beyond. The original inhabitants of the area that is now Dahlonega included the Lower Muskogee Creek tribe, as well as the Georgia tribe of Eastern Cherokee. There were 18 additional tribes that dotted the Georgia landscape, heavily influencing those early inhabitants, and we want to honor those individuals and their contributions to the people in the land as well. Now, Dahlonega has a bit of a complicated history in that it is the site of the first U.S. gold rush and also the origin point for the Trail of Tears. Now, we know that over 5,000 Cherokee lost their lives during that forced removal from the North Georgia region to what is now Oklahoma. And as a result, in current Georgia, there are no federally recognized tribes. Now, it's important to note that Indigenous people and the tribes that we're acknowledging are not relics of the past. They continue to demonstrate their gifts, their expertise, and their contributions to many fields, including education, just like what we're studying now. This acknowledgement is just one small part of acknowledging and supporting Native American communities. And we encourage you to look at the conference app as well as the conference website to learn a lot more about the Georgia tribe of Eastern Cherokee and the Lower Muskogee Creek tribes, as well as ways in which we can continue to learn from these tribes and stand in solidarity with all Native nations. Now, when we deciding on a theme, we really felt like this was the time. Transfer was once again experiencing a moment, but yet there was so much movement ahead. And so when we think about moments in transfer, something feels a little bit different right now. Like we aren't alone in our concerns. We are now being joined by other higher education organizations, by other think tanks, and by philanthropic organizations to ask those really challenging questions. Why aren't transfer students succeeding? Why are those students who decide that they want to transfer, why are they not making that transition? And why is it that that is affecting our students of color in students who are low income even more disproportionately? We know that once students can make the transition, they often do as well, if not better, than their counterparts. However, we're just not seeing enough people making that transition. So here we are to talk about it. The other moments that we're experiencing are, of course, the social reckoning related to systemic racism, both within higher education and beyond, and taking a critical look at where transfer fits in that moment. And then, of course, the lingering pandemic continues to influence what we were already experiencing related to fluctuating and changing student demographics. There's a lot going on related to moments in the world of transfer. And then there are those moments that happen every single day at your institutions when you are working one-on-one with your students, whether virtually, in person, or via email, and helping those students to figure out where they're headed, what they need in order to accomplish their goals. And it's those moments that are so impactful for these proven scholars in many cases. Your work with them and your moments of interacting with them are the things that propel them forward, that help them gain momentum and truly help them move towards their goals. So when we think about movement, let's be really clear. If we are sincerely concerned about our students' outcomes, then we have no choice but to come together and bring all of these moments and create a larger movement. Now, this is a movement that doesn't shy away from putting transfer squarely in the equity conversation. And this is a movement that doesn't rely on incremental change, but rather this is a movement that takes courage, consistency, and collaboration. And that's why we've brought all of you together here to think through what those moments are in your individual worlds and how we can come together collectively to move towards a larger movement on behalf of our transfer students and students who are mobile. So where do we start? Well, we're about to engage with an amazing panel from the Tackling Transfer Policy Advisory Board under the moderation of Kristen Moore of HCM Strategist. They're going to spend time really talking about what they've learned together in their attempts to reset transfer. And I can't wait for that to set the tone for the rest of the conference. We are thrilled that you're here. We're going to learn lots together. We encourage you to catch the replays, look at the on-demand sessions, check out the St. Louis content, because together we can shape the future of transfer.
No surprise to you is that most transfer students face an uphill battle. They're contending with unclear information and insufficient guidance, and they're having to navigate a very complex process. And so with that in mind, if you can please go to slide 2, driven by the data and really focused on improving student transfer outcomes, HCM had the great opportunity, as Janet mentioned, to partner with SOVA and the Aspen Institute College Excellence Program to lead an initiative called Tackling Transfer. And that work was made possible by the generous contributions of the Ascendium, Kresge, Joyce, and ECM foundations, and most importantly, the intensive partnerships within 3 states, Minnesota, Texas, and Virginia. And the overall focus of that work really was to convene stakeholders and to advance institutional practice while keeping in mind how state policy can set the conditions in order to support equitable transfer, keeping students at the center. So as we worked across the 3 states, a key strategy was, how do we elevate these lessons learned? And how do we more intentionally develop policy recommendations in order to better support the practitioners? So with that in mind, that the Policy Advisory Board was established to help broaden the reach and to engage thought leaders outside of our organization in the 3 states that we were within. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So excitingly, the Policy Advisory Board and their work is where we're going to get to focus our time today. The board has honestly spent a tremendous amount of time sharing thought partnership, engaging in what could be, considered really tough conversations about how we better serve transfer students. So as you can see here, the 12 members are listed on the screen, and each of them bring, a diverse perspective. They come from different backgrounds, different lived experiences, representing different regions. But even with all those differences, the board was really united in having experience as expert practitioners, understanding the complexities of transfer, having reputations in the field as leaders, and honestly, always maintaining a laser focus on equity. So today I'm joined by 4 of the board members who I am excited to call and join and share the screen with today. I like to call them heavy hitters because honestly, they each bring their own perspective. So I am excited to share the screen today with Ron Anderson, who's the Senior Vice Chancellor for Academic and Student Affairs at the Minnesota State College and University. I'm also joined by Cheryl Hyman. She's the Vice Provost for Academic Alliances at Air State University. I'm joined by Elena Carissa Lavanas, who's the Assistant Commissioner for Academic Policy and Student Success and the Chief of Staff at the Massachusetts Department for Education. And I'm also joined by Shauna Smith-Jaggers, who's the Assistant Vice Provost of Research and Program Assessment at The Ohio State University. Excitingly, the majority of our time will be hearing from them and leaning into their expertise. If you go to the next slide, please. Encouragingly, the board's journey honestly really reflects the conference theme, from moment to movement, shaping the future of transfer. And this is really tangible because the board is united in its charge for something bigger and broader. They're going to have the opportunity in a little bit to talk to you a little bit more, but they were really looking to challenge the status quo and move towards a transfer reset. And there are kind of 3 key areas that they were really advocating for. One is that relevant learning not only be recognized, but it be applied, that there be supportive policies that aid students across their learning journey, and then that there be more streamlined transfer pathways and traditions, starting in K through 12 and leading all the way into the workforce. If you go to the next slide, please. So honestly, this work is important and it's relevant, especially because we know today's students look much different than when transfer policy was originally thought up. And our work, if it's going to be successful, must be responsive to the different students at different parts of their learning journey. There are many pathways and many forms of learning, and these data points just provide a high-level overview of the many phases and students on the transfer journey. If you could go to the next slide, please. So, to that end, the policy board worked collectively on a set of recommendations and a framework that aids the field in being more forward-thinking about our approach to transfer. An important aspect of the board's framework is how it situates transfer policy more holistically. And so we're going to have some time in a little bit where they're going to be able to dive deeper into what they believe the field should tackle first when it comes to the framework, but also what's important to keep in mind. Our current transfer policies often tend to focus on building pathways, and the board really seeks to create an overarching framework that weaves in attention to areas such as finance and data, and more importantly, how to engage stakeholders across the board, such as accreditors who we know are not actively engaged at this moment. This level of change requires, a lot of broad relational and transformative change. But the great news is that they have given a lot of thought to this. And the policy recommendations were also undergirded with a set of stakeholder engagement strategies really designed to drive the reform that we believe is necessary for a more equitable ecosystem around policy. If you can go to the last slide, please. One of the biggest takeaways, in the board discussion we'll dive deeper into today, is that our current transfer system is not serving students well. And those most impacted are our students of color and those from low-income backgrounds. This policy is not only something that can change its trajectory, but it's something that we have committed to thoughtfully and intentionally sharing concrete ways into building a stronger system. So to that end, I'd like to invite the panelists to join me on the screen. And I'm going to begin with a few questions to get the audience to kind of better understand what the work looked like over the past year. And then I'll invite the audience to use the question and answer chat to also be able to ask your own questions. So if I may, I'll start by posing a question to Elena and Ron. So as I mentioned, the theme of this conference really is from movement to movement, shaping the future of transfer. Earlier, I talked about how we're using data to drive our decision-making, and the national data on transfer student outcomes are clear. In all 50 states, we see that completion rates for transfer students are far too low. And there are honestly deep inequities by race, ethnicity, and by income. As you reflect on the theme of the conference and the moral imperative to eradicate and focus in on equity gaps, what do you think must happen next as it pertains to transfer?
Sure, I'll begin. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As I thought about this question, there are really three primary things that I think must happen. And first and foremost, I think that one of the challenges that we have avoided for a fair amount of time that we can no longer avoid is really critically examining and breaking the higher education caste system, if you will. We know that we have disparate outcomes between or across student groups. We need to be asking who we're keeping out and why. And for us in Minnesota, that plays out in two different ways. One is about how we view transfer students. A while back, I was in conversation with a university faculty member who informed me that their role was not to serve as a finishing school for those community college students. And that was so striking to me in terms of some of the perspectives we need to change. We know that we have a hierarchy across institutions, and the system that I serve is comprised of 32-year colleges, both transfer-oriented as well as technically oriented, and then 7 regional universities. So thinking about how we break through that hierarchy, because it absolutely plays out in transfer decisions as well as the experiences of our students. And we have to draw others into the discussion. We can't leave this as an individual faculty member or even individual department discussion any longer, and really challenge the assumptions about veto power that we have provided and allowed to continue that is not always exercised in an appropriate manner, I would suggest. I think the second key thing is really rethinking how we structure and build our curriculum. And if you think back about how an individual program is developed, historically, we've developed them for incoming students that began in our institutions. So there are some good reasons that curricula is designed the way it is, but it does not accommodate people coming in at different points, right? And we had a great example of that in Minnesota about almost a decade ago. I learned of an economics major at one of our universities had been redesigned very thoughtfully to integrate data science concepts throughout the curriculum into every course, which is great if you start out there. But if you transfer in and you have the general economics coursework, you don't have that component. And so students were oftentimes retaking courses. Again, good design if you're assuming that everyone's coming in as a first-year student, but not a design that really is supporting transfer. So I think understanding that we have to think more deeply about who we're serving and how we design our curricula in ways then that is going to allow for those differential entry points and still a cohesive curriculum that results in a well-educated student. And I guess the third thing that I would say from where I sit as the senior vice chancellor and provost of a large system, it's really thinking about how we leverage the power of systemness. And then how do we recenter the conversation around our students in transfer and not around our curriculum in transfer? That doesn't mean that the curriculum doesn't matter, because it's absolutely imperative, but the focus has been on how do these courses line up and how do we make sure that the curriculum articulates from one to another, and we've not given sufficient time and understanding, I think, about the students' experience and what the students bring beyond the curriculum that they've encountered as prior to transfer, and what that means for how we design our programs. So I think that the exciting thing right now is that I think we're seeing some change in the collective will to engage in some of these discussions. And for us in the Minnesota state system, it really is playing out in how we work across institutions and what do we as system leaders move from both a policy and a practice standpoint, and how do we appropriately balance some of those tensions of individual autonomy at the institutional level with the broader common good for our students across the state.
Thanks, Ron. So many of the same similar concepts that I wanted to touch on. So before building on that, just really want to thank NISTS for continuing this work and really appreciate the theme of today's conference, as well as being joined by my colleagues on the Tackling Transfer Advisory Board. So just a little bit about Massachusetts to provide additional context. So we are both a mix of governing and coordinating board, depends on who you ask. We have 15 community colleges, 9 regional comprehensive state universities, and 5 UMass campuses, including a medical school. And so similar to other systems, and like Ron just described, there is institutional stratification here in the Commonwealth, and I would argue that that's the case right across all 50 states, and that's something that is by design. And so recognizing that our system wasn't intended to serve the majority of students who currently attend post-secondary institutions, I think is critical. And part of the reason why we need to do that is in recognition that this isn't a moment, and that it is a movement. And if you're committed to equity, you're committed to equity yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And that means being committed to transfer in this conversation, right? Because we know that the majority of students of color attend community colleges, which are also happen to be the most under-resourced institution, and 80% of those students want baccalaureate degrees. And so it's on us to make sure that we can make that happen. And so part of that really is a cultural change that I think a lot of us are familiar with, and that's the switch from college-ready students to student-ready colleges and universities, and making sure that the language aligns with that. So it's not that students are at risk, right? It's more that institutions are at risk of failing these these students, it's not that students didn't graduate, it's that our institutions didn't graduate the students. And I think making sure that our language reflects the cultural change that we want to see helps in the policymaking conversation. And that means also race conscious policymaking, not race neutral policymaking, because the data that Kristen showed shows that there are racial disparities. And so if we continue to repeat the cycle of not being specific about who we want to serve, we're going to see that bear out in our data. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important to disaggregate the data, is that you have to be completely transparent about who it is that you're trying to serve and the reasons why we haven't been able to serve them well. And the them as students. So making sure that they're a part of the conversation as a critical stakeholder is really, really important conversation when we're trying to figure out how to do that in Massachusetts, because it's too often that students are in the room and I'm sitting on the 14th floor of a building in Boston with very little sense of what's happening on the ground or virtually. And students know best, and we need to recognize their lived experiences. And I'm glad to say that the Tackling Transfer Advisory Board has invited students to be a part of the conversation so we can hear directly from them. And so just also want to recognize the work in this space. We have the opportunity to build on really good policies and programs. I feel like this has been a conversation that we have been having for a very long time. It's just an opportunity to shift it in a different direction. And I think I don't want us to feel like we haven't done work. There's been so much work, right? We have engaged so many people in the conversation, not just faculty, but transfer advisors, registrars, provosts, chief student affairs officers, so much good work. There's just more work that needs to be done.
Thank you both. And you both raised how important it is to understand who we're serving, how we design our curriculum, how we recenter around students to become student-ready institutions, how we better serve students who aren't being served well, particularly students of color, how language matters, and how we have the opportunity to shift into a new direction. And that really kind of leads me to my next question for Cheryl and Shauna. During the Policy Advisory Board discussions, you and your peers really talked about how currently higher education is designed in a way that it sorts students very effectively into particular institutions and pathways. And that historically, as we define transfer, in order to fix that function in the student experience, it won't be fixed in that historical definition. So can you all share more about your thoughts or how you would encourage people to think about transfer in the future and what that would look like?
Shauna, you want me to go first? Okay, well, first I want to thank NISTS for this opportunity, and it's been a privilege serving on the panel with, as you can see, some very esteemed and knowledgeable colleagues who I had the pleasure of learning from. So thank you all for that. My main proposal is that we need to rethink the whole concept of transfer. As I would say it, the old school way of thinking was a linear progression from lower division to upper division classwork that would then add up to a bachelor's credential at the university. I think that way of thinking is just antiquated given the ways learners actually interact with the intersecting systems that constitute higher education in America today. Learners take college courses while they're in high school that then in most cases is transferred into colleges and universities. Learners are moving between two-year institutions as they access different programs or simply a different time and place to receive their education. Learners move between four-year institutions for many of the same reasons, and learners move in and out of the labor market in higher education as needed. In fact, in many cases, they are both enrolled in school and participating in the labor market. Now, this doesn't even scratch the surface of adults returning to graduate school or pursuing specific programs to gain entry to a career of choice over time, such as accessing certificates, industry credentials, and continuing education in particular. So the complexity has increased significantly, and the learners are telling us what they need. However, higher education as an industry does not do a good enough job of listening to what those requirements are. The one size fits all is just antiquated. That leaves all of us with the question of how should we respond? First, I would encourage all of us to reconfigure our mindsets. We have to reconfigure the way we think about this. Transfer students can have more or less than 12 credit hours when they arrive at our institutions. Second, transfer students may arrive from the labor market, from 2 years, from 4 years, from vocational high schools. Third, this broader definition of transfer students are in many institutions already the majority of our student enrollment. That means that we need to be much more sophisticated in our segmentation and serve a broad heterogeneous group that is currently somewhat unhelpfully grouped as transfer students. So in short, I think the dichotomy of transfer and non-transfer students has to be broken down in order to serve the broad diversity of students that arrive and move between each of our institutions. I believe it is in all of our interests to serve all students in a way that minimizes friction when they move in and out of our respective areas of influence. So I really think this is a perfect example where we need to get past the moment and really start moving.
All right, great. Thank you, Cheryl. And thank you, Kristen. And nice to see everybody here. Thank you for having us here today. So I want to +1 everything that Cheryl said, especially for older working students who really need a flexible program that sort of recognizes and validates their existing skills and helps them build on those skills into the next step in their career. But one thing we need to be careful of is we don't want to force each learner to navigate their own way through disparate, disconnected learning experiences and try to sort of create their own program on the fly. We need to create frameworks and structures that make it easy to sort of take those experiences and weave them together in a clear way for students. So especially if we think about, older workers who have like great time management skills and sort of know how to take various pieces and weave them together, they're in a much better position to do that than sort of 18, 19, 20-year-old students who are just sort of figuring out, how to learn on their own and how to make their own pathway. So when we do research with students and interviews about their experiences, a lot of the younger students in particular tell us that they do best when they have a very straight, clear, structured pathway, which a lot of other students and friends are all going through at the same time and the same way. So they can sort of see clearly the way forward and have friends and supports who are doing that with them. And so the challenge is to sort of intentionally design a system that has both the flexibility for students who really need the flexibility, and that has the structure for the students who need the structure. And so I think, a potentially good example of this at our institution. So Ron mentioned earlier that lots of programs are designed for freshmen who begin at the institution. And it makes sense for us to be thinking about designing programs that are specifically for transfer students and for the needs of transfer students. So at our institution, we have specific transfer pathways to BS degrees in nursing and in health science. And both of these degrees were designed for transfer students and really designed with working professionals in mind. I mean, especially when somebody is already an RN, they have a lot of strengths. They can be successful in their field. They can be successful in an online program, which has a lot fewer capacity constraints than an in-person program. And so these programs don't have to restrict entry with outrageously high bars, with GPAs and in a long list of prerequisites. These programs can actually guarantee students entry as long as they meet a very reasonable set of minimum requirements that they will have met already if they're RNs. And then these students can finish their BSN in 3 semesters if they go full-time, or 5 semesters if they go part-time. And this is, this is a great situation for a working professional. But then what about your 19-year-old community college student? Like, how do they get into a program like that? So to help these students get onto that more sort of worker-oriented pathway, we've partnered with 7 area community colleges on what we call the Path to BSN, which starts very structured in the community college. And on their way to the associate degree, the student can go ahead and apply for early entry to the BSN program and start taking university courses while they're still at community college. They get their associate degree, they get placed as an RN, and then their hospital employer will pay for them to finish the BSN program at Ohio State. And I think this is the kind of system that's like intentionally designed with, okay, what do our students have already and what do they need? And that's going to be a little different for different segments of students, but as long as we're designing the program to bring them in at specific intentional points, it will work for both kinds of students. And it's actually great too, because the community college students are in some of the same classes with the working RNs, and they start to get exposure to what is it actually like to work in this field and to be in this role. So that's what I will say about that.
Thank you both. And I think that you both were elevating some key points, right? I heard the old way of transfer is kind of this linear progression. And we know that we can't continue to be a one size fits all. This broad umbrella of how we're grouping transfer students is outdated and it's not serving students well. So we have to think about the different journeys and prioritize flexibility for different students, such as, the working professionals, but also structure for students on the more traditional path. And so the question becomes, how can we think about that in a way that continues to provide structure, but moves us towards more targeted path, especially for students who aren't being served well by our current systems. So before I hop into my next question, I wanted to just pause and see if anyone on the panel wanted to just chime in based on anything that your colleagues have shared. Okay. So then my next question is for Elena and Cheryl. One of the things that the board really has done that greatly benefited the field was releasing a report that provides guidance on what a transfer reset might look like, but also you all then provided key recommendations. And they were really focused in on 3 key areas: harnessing data for transformational change, maximizing credit applicability and recognition of learning, and advancing strategic finance and impactful student aid. So from your perspective, which are you most excited to see the field tackle? Or maybe where do you think the field should start?
Thanks, Kristen. So I'll go first, and Cheryl, I'll pop it over to you afterwards. And it's hard to pick one because they're also so interrelated, right, in many ways, which I think is one of the things that the board talked about. But I want to pick up on something that Shauna said, which I think is applicable, which is the intentionality piece. And so when you layer intentionality and you're looking at all of this, it starts to look different, right? And so when you're talking about harnessing data, I remember being in conversation with one of our deans who said, well, do you know the breaking points for all of your 41 statewide transfer pathways and where that happens by institution? And talk about the power of harnessing data. Like, no, at this state we don't, but we need to, right? And so there was a whole conversation around how do you then start to collect that data, the need to disaggregate the data. And sometimes you don't have the data, and that's okay. But I think making sure that there's agreement that that's data worth collecting is important, because I think there was a question around reporting in the Q&A that we'll get to in a second. And just on that data piece, one thing that we've really tried to shift away from in Massachusetts is the obsession with just quant data, right? And the over-reliance on quantitative data. And quantitative data is very helpful to start a conversation, but it doesn't give us a holistic picture. And if we need a holistic approach to supporting students, we have to have conversations with folks, right? And so making the time to do qualitative research, not only with our students, but with folks on the ground, because we're challenging the assumptions that we at the state know what's right also. And that gets to the engaging stakeholders piece. And so they all start to weave together, because then the institutions are wondering what you're going to do to hold them accountable. So you introduce performance incentive funding, if that's something that you have in your state, but then also questioning how you award financial aid. And why is it that there isn't a ton of financial aid for transfer students when they get to their universities, but there is a ton for first-year students, right? And so that bifurcation that I think Cheryl was talking about, this old notion of transfer, even that othering has impacts besides just the transfer of credit. And that has to do with the experience of also coming to the university and not knowing where to go, not even knowing where the financial aid office is, because you already figured that out at your community college, but now you're at a whole new institution. Who's there to guide you? And I think the data will help us figure out where we need to guide students. So there's just so much there. But I'm excited about the fact that we put this out and are trying to implement it ourselves. And so it's not just talk, it's also walk. And that has been incredibly helpful as a state to be able to point to this resource and all of the wonderful and intelligent folks who are on the board to say, these are the things that we need to be doing, because sometimes you do need that external push in order to have or continue the conversation.
Thanks, Alana. Obviously, I agree wholeheartedly and will second that. Since I was forced to pick one, I would say the primary area out of the three for me is around maximizing credit applicability. I think the current processes simply do not allow learners to understand how their choices of coursework impact their ability to complete the program that they are pursuing or that they want to pursue. So at ASU, we have built out an important tool that we call My Path to ASU. It allows students at any community college to lay out their own pathway to any of our 400 majors, consisting of the coursework that they will need at their community college. So it gives them a semester by semester prescription of what they need to take before they even get to us to ensure that applicability. But this ensures full applicability, which is what we're trying to do, not just 30 credits or 20 credits, but full applicability of their coursework when they arrive at ASU, if they start their educational planning and proceed on track to completion of their associate degree. This type of process and technology change needs to be scaled up dramatically, though. Many institutions have designed their own guided pathway programs, which is good. However, they need to explicitly connect to other institutions, or it could hurt the student's ability to get on and stay on their path. Imagine it's as if every town and country built their own road and rail lines without any concern for interoperability with other geographies. That's the way we once did and sometimes do things, but students have much higher expectation nowadays, and they should. It's on us to build the infrastructure of the future that serves learners much better than today.
Thank you both so much. And I'm appreciative of all the people that are using the question and answer function. And Cheryl, there was actually a direct question for you around the pathway that you just mentioned. Is that pathway ASU only for community colleges in Arizona?
No, it's actually for all domestically accredited community colleges nationally.
Great, thank you. There's also another question in the chat that really both Elena and Cheryl gave good insights on, and it really does dive deeper into two of the areas that we elevated. So I'll offer up this question to any of the panelists, but I will elevate for you, Ron, that it does mention the caste system that you raised earlier. So the question is, how does state funding, so the strategic finance part, and then state reporting, the harnessing data across the country, play into the caste system mentality where transfer students are not prioritized? So I'm not sure which panelists might want to chime in on that. And I'll repeat the question. Go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit from Minnesota's perspective. I think on the finance side, the way that our state allocations are determined absolutely feed into that, right? What appropriations go to the systems. So within Minnesota, we have two large systems: the University of Minnesota system, which is comprised of the R1, the land grant institution, and 4 other universities part of their system, and then Minnesota State. For decades, our legislature had thought equality, right? If they give this much to the U of M, they have to give this much to Minnesota State, though we serve more than 3 times, I believe, the number of students. So the equity focus does not exist within the funding streams, I would suggest, right? It's really based on we need the politics of giving some to everybody. Excuse me a second. And I think we see some of that playing out in the reporting as well. When we look at the metrics, you look at IPEDS measures, you look at even more localized state and institutional measures, we don't differentiate about the success of transfer students. We don't talk about them and the graduation rates of transfer students at our universities. And we also, so I think even what's measured and the things to which we're held accountable don't acknowledge that. One of the things we've recognized in Minnesota State, that at our universities, about 1/3 of the incoming students now are transfer students. But if you look at the graduating class on any given year, more than half of them are transfer students. So you think about the incredible impact that has on the operations of the universities and where we need to go in the future. It really drives some different kinds of conversations. But I think the funding, as well as the tuition structures at universities versus our colleges, all play into really maintaining a lot of that differentiation, as do the reports that we have to submit, both locally and nationally.
Yeah, and I would just, Ron, I was so excited when you were speaking, because I think that's true nationally, right? Like, it's not just Minnesota, it's probably every single state. So I feel comfortable saying that, right? And we also have an organization like SHIO who tells us annually with the Chef reports what the numbers look like. It's by design, right? And so we continue to perpetuate the design. So that strategic finance conversation is so critical. And similarly in Massachusetts, 1/3 of our incoming class at all of our universities, at least, are freshmen, or sorry, are transfer students. And so they make up, if you want to talk about interest convergence, there is an economic argument to be made. I think there was a question in the chat around, like, if it's not going to be morals, which it is in our state, but if it's not going to be the moral argument, like the economic argument really is quite powerful. There's also a reason why that hasn't worked, right, when we've made that case in the past. But money does talk. And I will say that in Massachusetts, one of the ways that we talk about success is we actually use the VFA metric for success. So states aren't necessarily required to use the IPEDS metrics. And so we did that in collaboration with all of our community colleges, in recognition that that IPEDS metric really doesn't account for the work that the community colleges do to support students. And we also do report, when we report on graduation, the percent of students that institutions graduated who are transfer students. So wanting to make sure that putting back the onus on the institutions. But that's a great question, and it's by design. So that's something really difficult to fight against, and you have to be intentional when doing so.
Thank you both for chiming in, and would like to encourage the audience to continue to use the question and answer, as we'll be periodically checking questions there. To continue the discussion, Shauna, I wanted to ask you about another one of the sub-themes of this conference, which is really around the intersection between institutional policy and practice. In your role at Ohio State, how have you seen institutional policies focused on transfer students? And has it been influencing practices?
Yeah, so I would say that our institutional policy is highly influenced by state policy. So in the state of Ohio, we are required to accept as transfer students any community college student who has at least 60 credits with at least a 2.0 GPA. And we are also required to accept a wide array of introductory courses that are, if they're from a public Ohio community college or four-year college, we're required to accept them as equivalent to, as if they were taken at our own university. And these policies have been in place since long before I got there. So I don't know how people responded to them when they were first enacted. I wouldn't be surprised if some people thought the sky was falling and that university would crumble as a result of policies like this. But by the time I got there in 2016, it was just accepted. You know, this is the way it was. We had thousands of transfer students every year. The world hadn't ended. So, you know, people didn't have, it was interesting that people didn't necessarily have a lot of thoughts about transfer students. If you asked people about transfer students, they'd be like, oh yeah, I think we have a lot of them. But, you know, it was not like a, you know, like a major issue on campus. But we were able to sort of build on the state policy when we really wanted to take a closer look at like what are the outcomes of our transfer students. Like we know we have a lot of them, we know they are a lot of our graduates, but what are their retention rates? What are their, you know, are they accumulating excess credits at the point that they earn their degree? How can we try to streamline and support their pathway through the university? Having those state policy frameworks to be able to discuss with stakeholders, faculty, chairs, program managers across the university, like why we have so many transfer students and why it's important for us to ensure their success. It's just really, really helpful to say like, okay, the reality is we have to do this and we want to do it. And this is how we're going to do it. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but.
Yeah, it does. You know, you talked a lot about the role that state policy plays in supporting the institution, but then you talked about the ownership that the institution has to have in order to carry out the work to directly support the students. And one of the questions that we received really does come back to this institutional piece. So I want to pose this again to any of the panelists. And it really is about how if the institution that you work with seems almost discouraged or they penalize transfer, how do you start to move the dialogue of your institution towards more equitable and positive transfer? And it almost seems as if it requires massive resources to develop things such as what was mentioned around ASU. So is there any progress or similar tools for other institutions and systems who don't have access to similar resources?
Yeah, so I'll obviously start by addressing that question. So there is a lot going on in I think ed tech and with other institutions around how do we solve this credit mobility issue. I am starting to see movement and hear things of that nature. So there are, I do think, lots of people who are working on that. But I'll also say, I haven't said here in any of my answers, but we too at ASU are working on a more of a national solution. I think my path to ASU served as a platform. First of all, it wasn't developed overnight. It took a while. I mean, we have within that platform over 1 million course equivalencies that we've evaluated from domestically accredited community colleges nationally. So this is something that we have been building for some time, but we are now in a phase using what we've learned from that to build a national solution as well. Although our goal is to ensure learners succeed here at ASU, we also have an interest in making sure that, as I said before, these types of things are scalable beyond us to help contribute to the larger issue. But so there are other things that I would say, technologies that I think are in play, including some that we're working on here at ASU.
So one of the things that Cheryl just raised was around, broadening their reach. And so one of the questions that we received is, how do you build flexibility for adult learners who seem to prefer online learning when your university is not structured to support online learning and has very little online courses to accommodate the swath of adult learners who want to take all online courses?
Okay, I'll break the weird silence. I'll just keep going. um, I think this is truly one of those moment to movement times that we're living in. I think that we all, as we lead various parts of these institutions, are going to have to really now sit down and figure out how the world has changed, how it will continue to change, and how rapidly it will continue to change, and be far more strategic in where we invest and what we invest in. I think Alana made a great point about it's not the student's fault. It's how we respond to what the learners and students need. And so thinking about how we make different types of investments, what we invest in, we really have to figure out how to be much more strategic, much more responsive, and at a time when resources are scarce, how to be much more resourceful with the resources we already have.
Absolutely.
If I could,
I'll go ahead, Ron.
sorry, okay. I would just add, I think this is one of the areas where the pandemic has actually led to some helpful, positive movement for us, right? Within our system, we had very limited online offerings at the university level. Some institutions fairly involved, others really not at all. We have seen over the last 2 years, numerous faculty kind of reacting in sometimes surprise and certainly delight of, wow, gosh, I can do this, and this actually can work in my discipline. We were incredibly limited in our technical colleges, for example, during the early days of lockdown and trying to figure out how are you going to continue a hands-on program in a virtual environment. And folks have adopted some amazing solutions that we would have told you 2 years ago were impossible. So I think there's been a very helpful disruption in our kind of typical approach to delivery that has happened because of the pandemic. We're having conversations now about what does it look like moving into an endemic phase, and what is that balance of instructional delivery mode going to look like? And it's multi-pronged. You know, we keep focusing first and foremost on what is the best pedagogy for the type of program you're delivering. It has to be grounded in the content and the pedagogy needs. But then what do the students want, to the point of adult learners and working adults? You know, we've seen folks that will say, I really want to be there in person, but the registration pattern goes counter to that. And for other reasons, they'll take on, you know, students will enroll in online courses. So thinking about what the students want and need, what's the link to the pedagogy that's necessary and appropriate for the content? And then what do faculty excel at? That also has to be part of the discussion. And it gets to be a tension-filled discussion when I may have my personal preferences on which way I want to deliver courses. So how do you balance those tensions and really recognize that we've got folks who are just outstanding in that delivery mode, and we really need to support them and grow that capacity broadly. And for others, that may never be a real successful delivery mode. So how do we think about staffing? How do we think about preferences and learning styles and all of those pieces that fit together? But as we look at better serving adult learners in particular as we move into the future, I think we've learned some really important things over the last couple of years that will help support us in making that transition. And it's going to be a bumpy sorting out, I think. I don't think any of us expect or want to go back to where we were in the fall of 2019. Right? That's not our goal. The goal is to figure out what's the next new place we need to be as we move into the future. And that's why I think the timing of these discussions is so incredibly important. So it's a moment we can't afford to lose or to miss in efforts to get comfortable again with what was certainty of life pre-pandemic.
I think part of that, the question was also, how do you build capacity to be able to offer enough online courses in the first place to put together a program? And, you know, it may vary by institution or institution, but it does seem to be helpful to have a centralized online learning function at your college, and rather than relying on individual departments and chairs and deans to come up with the courses that they want to offer online, having somebody who's a central coordinator who goes to departments and says, okay, how can we build an online program with you? Because having like a central architect and coordinator who's actually sort of thinking about it in that, that umbrella sense, I think will get you a lot farther than if you're trying to like weave together a bunch of bottom up things from different departments. I don't know if that resonates with the rest of you on the call, but I feel like I've seen that at least a couple different institutions.
Definitely. And I mean, I think just building on the comments, your budget, like your institution's budget, reflects its values. So that's one place to look, and that'll tell you what the administration really cares about. So if that's publicly available, depending on the institution, that's a place to start. And I think to your point around centrality, like there has to be a commitment from the institution in order to make that happen, Shauna. And I feel like that's one way to signal that, right? Is that we really care about the student population. So we've invested the resource in creating an office that does that. In addition to that, I mean, Ron, to your point, like what do students want? And there's a need to have the conversation with the student, because there's also the assumption that this is the only way that adults want to engage in their learning. And that feels very unfortunate. And it goes back to who has access to what, right? And so what I often think of when I hear those questions is the practical reality that online learning does provide access for several who cannot attend post-secondary in person, and that the classic traditional in-person residential experience is then only reserved for a certain group of people. So I just worry about the way we answer, in general, the question from a policy and implementation standpoint, so that we don't continue the othering. And then also just going beyond online courses, one of the conversations that we're having is semesters. That's a really long time if you're talking about working adults to commit to going to school full time, right? If that's what it says to go on to graduate on time. So all of the terminology also is fascinating, because you're asking working adults to complete at least 15 credits for 4 semesters to graduate on time. And that once again goes to the fact that this is not designed to do what we intend it to do now. And so it's not just the online learning, it's the semesters, it's the curriculum, it's who's having the conversations with the students. And students are going to vote with their feet. I'm in the Northeast, we've been having a conversation around declining enrollment for a very long time. Students have already started to vote with their feet. We are losing them. They are not coming to us. Our enrollments are down, our transfer rates are down. So it is an economic imperative for many institutions that are tuition driven. And so that's something that they're just going to have to wrestle with. That's not all institutions, but there are several that frankly rely on transfer students to keep their doors open, and we just don't do enough to serve those students.
No, and I appreciate everything that everyone has been elevating. And there really is kind of this underlying theme that you all have been saying, which is around equity, right? How do we better serve adult students? How do we transition after COVID to put things in place to meet students where they're at? How do we think about things in these non-linear way where we are not thinking about just semesters, but how their learning actually applies? So everything that you all have talked about really leads back into how do we better support students from an equitable perspective. So appreciate that. And there will be opportunities for you all to kind of continue to hone in on that. There are a few more questions coming in the chat. And since we only have about 5 minutes left, I wanted to circle back to some of the questions from the audience. So this next one is a little in the weeds, but I want to offer it since it was raised. And then I'll share even from my own perspective what I kind of see happening at the state level. But do you know if any state is using headcount instead of FTE to fund your public institutions?
It's a good question. It's a good question. I didn't realize that I was still off of mute.
Yeah, but since you chimed off, you want to chime in on that?
Other than it is a good question, and I feel like it might be, if we don't have an answer, one for our colleagues at SHIO. I was going to quickly look at the Chef report to see if there was, and I keep mentioning that report because their data was due not that long ago. But I don't have an answer to that. Maybe one of my colleague panelists do. Sorry, and I'm going to go on mute now.
Yeah. So as others look to chime in, I'll tell you that in specific policies, and this again might be a walking term, but outcomes-based funding or performance funding, I think there are 2 states that are doing that, Colorado and Virginia. But it is definitely a practice that I think the field is seeing value in, and that people are advocating that you move towards, because we know that part-time students and other students, to this point of credit applicability and not just counting students that full-time enrolled, is something we have to have in mind in order to meet more students. So appreciate the question, but I don't know if Cheryl or Ron or Shauna want to weigh in at all. Okay. So another question that we received goes back to this equity question. How do we increase equity for our international students that transfer from their home countries and often lose out as much more than our domestic students in the transfer process? So not sure if anyone wants to chime in on that.
I can chime in with, apologize for a somewhat non-answer in saying, at least in our conversations, this is not an area that we have actively engaged in Minnesota, right? We know it's an issue, but we have not done a lot of work in that area. I think it's an opportunity for us to get deeper into that. We have been beginning conversations, however, on a related component of how to assist international folks in getting employed with credentials, completed credentials from out of country, particularly in allied health fields, right? We have a severe crisis in that area. So there's some work going on around that end, but less so about transfer students in alignment with credit, credit programming here. The workforce piece it certainly relates in that it's looking at how to articulate, right, that educational training outside of the country, but rather towards a work credential or a work opportunity as opposed to an academic credential. So
Yeah,
area ripe for.
Yeah, I think one of the things too, just quickly, is that credit applicability piece, and just like having that conversation around why aren't we awarding credit for credits that are earned outside of the country, and what that mentality is. It feels very similar to the mentality that we show towards our community college colleagues. And so for us, it's a conversation around who gets to define knowledge. And so really going back to that prior learning assessment and making sure that there are multiple ways to demonstrate learning that happens outside of the classroom.
Yeah, Kristen, I will say, I do feel like, I don't have an answer to that question just yet, but I can tell you, I do feel like this is a problem that could be next. And when I say next, I mean like really close. Like I'm already having some of these conversations, and a lot of my colleagues are engaged in these conversations. But the differential between systems is so high that it's a little bit more difficult. But I can tell you that I and a lot of my other colleagues are trying to tackle this very question.
And so the last comment, as we're really coming up on time, it's not really a question, it's a comment. And so I want to offer it, and then I'm going to offer each of the panelists to respond and just give any final thoughts that they think would be great for those that have joined us today. So it was shared in the chat. Oftentimes, even though there may be transfer equivalency guarantees between state schools, that doesn't mean the credit is applicable across all majors. So a State Department of Higher Education can state that all credits are transferable between these schools, which most students would interpret as meaning that it's all going to contribute to their academic progress towards a degree. But it's a bit disingenuous when students' ultimate major ends up being able to apply to some of this guaranteed transfer, but only to specific requirements. So I have a sneaky suspicion that the panelists, and something they've discussed a lot. So I'm going to leave the last word to them to respond, and just any final thoughts.
Yeah, I'll start us off because this is probably one that I am extra passionate about. That is so incredibly true. There is a difference between transferability and applicability. And when we talk about quote unquote fixing the transfer problem, look, learners transfer every day. Transferring it is not where the problem exists. It's applicability and being able to navigate the complexities and this maze that we've constructed for them to navigate through. I think we have to really start being deliberate in our efforts and how we align our institutions, creating more technologies that can help us do that, because we have very large, complex institutions, so that learners understand the difference between transferability and applicability. I think if we don't do that, it's very deceptive to the learner, and it's not going to help us or them. So I think this is a huge issue that needs to be addressed, but we really need to start talking about credit applicability, and that's the big problem that we're trying to solve. We need to ensure that learners are on their right major path on day one and understanding what applicability looks like at institution A and then institution B to where they're trying to get to. And so we have to create what's like a GPS system for their learning. You know, if you use your GPS and you plug in where you want to go, it tells you how to get there. But even if you turn off where you're not supposed to be, it recalibrates you back to where you're going. We need to create systems and technologies that are that dynamic to help learners continue to understand how to navigate this, again, maze that we've created for them. Obviously, I wouldn't be saying that if I wasn't also trying to fix the problem myself, and I'm trying to work on some technologies like that. But I think differentiating between applicability and transfer is going to be crucial. Language matters.
Yeah, and it feels like part of the goal is for there not to be a distinction, because what we're essentially asking is for students to navigate a hidden curriculum. And we're saying that transferability isn't applicability. And now I have to have that conversation with an 18-year-old, a 22-year-old, and a 27-year-old and explain to them why. And I'm not going to have a good answer for that, right? Other than these systems, once again, weren't designed to serve them. And there are a lot of nasty reasons why. And so for us, that is why we started the conversation around applicability. We brought faculty together, we paid them, we gave them lunch to make sure that the courses were applicable, but that's also not the end of the conversation. At the end of the day, Bio 101 should be Bio 101 wherever you take it. We know that the content is so similar. The reasons why just aren't good enough anymore. They may have been good enough 15, 20, 30 years ago, but when you put the student at the center, just stops making sense. It's not equitable. It's the opposite of equity.
So I want to take some time to thank Cheryl, Ron, Shauna, and Elena for joining us today, and just for your larger contribution to joining the Policy Advisory Board. Thank you all for joining and listening in. At the start of the conversation, there was a link put in the chat that has the ability for you to find more resources, the board's report, and possibly an Inside Higher Education blog, where we do monthly updates on what transfer looks like, and blogs to give you all more information. So we really hope that you all use that resource toolkit, and we look forward to more conversations in the rest of the conference. Thank you all for your time today.
Thank all of our panelists. Kristen, thank you for doing such a nice job with moderation. Again, Elena, Shanna, Cheryl, Ron, your comments were spot on, 100%. And I'm, again, very grateful. And for those of us on this, having a chance to listen to this panel, I highly recommend that you watch this again. This was a very densely compact conversation that I feel like will put a lot of language around many of the observations that you have already made on your own campuses. And it will start the ball rolling. And then it also, they've given us so many specific strategies to really move toward that, the momentum toward that movement. So again, panelists, very grateful for your insights, the longevity of the work that you've put into the panel, to the advisory board, and then the work that you're committing to doing in the future. So very, very grateful for that. Now it's time for us to think about those folks doing great work on their campuses also. And I would like to turn it over to Judith Brower to move into our recognition, one of the favorite things we do every year, recognizing our transfer champions.
Thank you, Janet. This really is one of my favorite parts of my job, is getting to know our award winners through their applications. And as we move through this fairly quickly, I'd encourage you to look on the app and on our website to read more about these individuals and their work. And also just to take a moment and help this be a reminder to you of the impact of the positive work that you're doing on a daily basis. So we're going to cover 3 different categories of awards: the Benita C. Jacobs Transfer Champion Awards, the National Transfer Student Ambassadors, and the Research Grant Award winners. So first, the first category of the Transfer Champion Awards is the Catalyst category. And these are folks that have been making an impact in the field for close to 10 years. And they cover a wide range of responsibilities and roles. So I'm pleased to introduce you to the winners this year. First is Nicholas DeFalco. He's the Director of Transfer Admission at North Central College in Illinois. And Shelley Lemons. She is the Executive Director of the Office of Student Transitions at the City Colleges of Chicago. Now we'll move to the Rising Star category. These folks are a little bit newer to the field, around 3 to 5 years, but still having an impact. We have 5 winners in this category. First is LaQuanda Cole. She's the director of the UNLV CSN Transfer Program at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Megan Drangsveit is the director of Project RAISE at California State University, Fullerton. Michael DuPont is the senior program officer with the Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Philanthropies and involved with the Tulsa Transfer Project. Jeffrey Mayo is the assistant director of the first year experience at the University of Texas at Austin. And Keith Schott is the director of transfer, veteran, and non-traditional student programs at Princeton University. So congratulations to all of our transfer champion winners. Now we'll move to our National Transfer Student Ambassadors. And students are at the heart of our work. And so we really prioritize having their voice inform our work and be present at the conference. So each year we invite a group of students who compete to be a part of the conference. I encourage you to take a look at the panel session that they did in St. Louis that will be available shortly. And they also have some great blogs on our website to check out to help you get to know them better. First, we have Jan Pralo Contreras. He's at the University of California, Irvine. Herman Luis Chavez is at the University of California, Los Angeles. Noel Dana is at the University of Notre Dame. And Catherine Ibsen is at the University of California, Berkeley. So congratulations to all of our students. And again, I encourage you to check out their blogs and their session to get to know them. Finally, we have our Research Grant Award winners. We have 2 different projects. Both of these PIs are building on work that they've already done through their dissertations. The first goes to Dustin Grody, PI, and David Reaping, co-PI. They're looking at developing a theory of curricular complexity for transfer students and establishing content and construct validity. And then Shannon Hayes Buenaflor, PI, along with Alberto Cabrera, are looking at transfer efficacy and goal orientation among potential transfer students, and it's an exploratory study. So congratulations again to all of our award winners. We wish we were all in person and we could give some big round of applause to you all. We're looking forward to sharing more about them through possibly some podcast episodes later in the year. So stay tuned for that. And I would just say coming up next is concurrent session 1. So check out the great options for that, and then followed by the pet parade break. You don't want to miss that, as well as group conversations, which are a great opportunity to interact around some great topics, and then another round of sessions. So we look forward to seeing you in the app, on the social wall, and on the screen in session. So have a great day.